Hi everybody, Professor Cruz here. I want to take a few minutes to respond to some of the points and issues and ideas that people raised in your Ethics in Action Case Study 1 responses this week. And think about maybe some of the ethical questions that didn't get raised or that maybe are worth exploring just a little bit further as we think through the first of our 3 case studies here. Now, overall, I would say in the first sort of case study involving the Cayman Islands that sort of opinions were mixed about whether the punishment and jail time made sense or not. Were they too much or were they warranted? Most of you agreed that something should have happened, but a lot of you felt like the community service and fines that they initially had been given were enough. But I want to raise a few other ethical points for folks to think about, some of which you may have considered and some of which you may have not. The first one was, when you think about this case, would your opinion have changed if Skylar Mack had COVID-19 and had infected other people while she broke quarantine? So does the fact that she was positive or negative, would that play any role in your considerations of the ethics sort of her behavior? A related question is, when she left her hotel where she was supposed to be quarantined, and spent about 7 hours, according to media reports, out at the beach where her boyfriend Ramjeet was in the ski competition. She was not wearing a mask. So does that make a difference? The fact that she not only broke quarantine, but then was out socializing with other people without even basic health and safety precautions or social distancing precautions. So another kind of ethical question in terms of her behavior, thinking about this case. Now, a more, not necessarily important, but a more tricky question when we start to think about the ethics underneath this case, and particularly the ethics that were motivating or informing Mack's actions. Does the fact that she intentionally took off the bracelet, the tracking bracelet that they had given her when she first came into the Cayman Islands, play a role? So basically, she had a geofenced bracelet that would, alert someone when that bracelet went out of, a specific quarantine area over the hotel she was staying. And when she had initially had the bracelet put on, she had gone back to the authorities and told them that it was too tight, and so they loosened it for her. And because they loosened it, she was then able to slip it off and go out that next day to watch her boyfriend compete. So the fact that she knew she had to take the bracelet off in order to leave, and then she made a conscious effort to try to have the bracelet loosened to be able to take it off more easily, suggests that her actions were premeditated. She did think about it. This wasn't just a spur of the moment decision, and that she knew in order to break the law, she would have to get this bracelet off. So do those actions on her part, should those play any role in our ethical considerations of this case and how we think about her decision making and the underlying ethics that she used in responding to this? And then going sort of back to the earlier point, when you think about the ethics of this case, would your opinion change if in fact Mack had been positive with COVID-19 and someone else was exposed when she broke quarantine and then ended up dying? So we know that didn't happen, but it could have. So the question is, when we think about these ethical questions, should we weigh the potential harm that she could do with the actual harm that she did? So from we're thinking about sort of a hypothetical ethical perspective, do we need to take into account what could have happened or only what did happen? And how do we develop an ethical system only based on sort of after the fact events rather than potential future actions? Right? Because our ethics are supposed to inform how we sort of act in day-to-day interactions, which means we have to have a framework in place before we decide how to take those actions rather than creating it after the fact. So another question that some of you talked about in some way or another in your comments was about the sort of justness or the commensurability of the punishment. So a question here that goes sort of to the heart of some of these debates is, when that law went into effect, does that date matter? So a number of you mentioned the fact that since the law, sort of the updated COVID laws had just gone into effect effectively the day before she arrived, maybe they didn't know about these changes. But in fact, we know that there were already pre-existing COVID laws in place regarding quarantine, which said that if you broke quarantine, you could face up to a year in jail and a $1,000 fine. And that was then increased to 2 years and a $10,000 fine, and that was the law the day before that went into effect. So before Skylar and Ramjeet came back to the Cayman Islands for this competition, these earlier laws with a 1-year jail time and a $1,000 fine were already in place and had been in place for many months. So the punishment they initially faced and even the later sort of charges all could have fallen within the original existing jurisdictions of the COVID quarantines. So does that change how we might think about the ethical questions, where it wasn't perhaps a case that they just didn't know about these laws, but yes, the laws had changed, but they were already violating the laws that had been in place for many months before? And considering that Ramjeet is from the Cayman Islands and that Skylar Mack had visited there many times because her father is also a professional jet ski racer, that she may have actually been aware of these earlier laws as well. So does that timing, or should those questions of timing, play any role in our considerations of the ethical dilemmas involved in this case? Now, so we know that in fact Mac had tested negative both before and when she arrived on the island. So in a sense, the fact that nothing worse happened was sort of dumb luck. It was her good luck that she wasn't positive. But she could just have easily have been one of those million of asymptomatic spreaders who in fact are positive but aren't aware of it because they're not showing any signs, and then going out potentially causing more people to be infected. Now, when we think about what would be a fair punishment for violating these COVID restrictions or others, how do we decide this question of fairness? So if someone could be positive and infect other people, and they simply don't care, and in her case choose to break quarantine for her own kind of personal pleasure and supporting her boyfriend, how do we decide what should be a fair punishment for those kind of actions, particularly when we know that they were intentional, premeditated acts that maybe in her mind were fine, but from the perspective of the law were still violations? But how do we wrestle with this question of what would be right or just in terms of a punishment for something like this, and do underlying motivations and the surrounding factors force us to change our ethical frameworks or not? So that's an important question. How sort of rigid are our ethics, and what would cause us to sort of bend them in some situations? And how much can you bend ethics? Right? So that's a slightly different question that we'll also want to think about. You know, are ethics hard and fast rules that you always sort of live by, or are they more kind of guidelines that are flexible and can be bent or, you know, pushed here and there when it serves what we might deem are good or something that makes us happy? Now, a few of you also wrestled with this question that in a way all of us have been wrestling with since the COVID outbreak started, about this tension between individual sort of private liberties and public health and safety concerns. And a number of you mentioned that you were uncomfortable with the idea of the government sort of intruding into our personal and private lives, telling us what we should do. Some of you were more open to the argument about the government having some priority in putting public health and safety over private interest, but still being a little bit hesitant about where those lines should be drawn. In many ways, we could argue there's a lot of gray area here. But so one of these questions would be, if we accept that you should be able to do whatever you want sort of in your own home on your own time, even if that means going to, you know, a party with 500 other people where you're likely to be exposed to someone who might be infected, but then you go out and are interacting in public, at what point do your private actions then become a threat to public health and safety? And how do we make that kind of distinguishing criteria? And are those public health and safety concerns strong enough to warrant overriding our individual choices and preferences? Or perhaps put differently, is there a point when we believe that sort of public health and safety concerns should trump our personal preferences? And what ethical guidelines or what ethical frameworks would help us navigate and negotiate those kind of questions. And this gets to sort of a broader question in public policy, which is how do you sort of legislate these kind of ethics between personal and private spaces and freedoms and liberties. So we might, for example, think about, could one solution that tries to balance these two be to say, well, you can do whatever you want, in your own time at home, but when you're out in public, you have to wear a mask, you have to adhere to social distancing guidelines, and should you choose to break and violate those, you will be fined $500 or $1,000 or $10,000, something significant enough that it would be a deterrent from people continuing to do it, unlike, let's say, a $20 parking ticket where you might just pay it off and not really care. So are there ways to both respect people's individual rights and choices, but also make them accountable to the greater kind of public body? And what ethical framework would we use to kind of make those arguments? So there's just a few additional thoughts I wanted to add to this first part of our ethics in action case studies. One, thinking about coronavirus and the Cayman Islands case. Now, when we turn to our second story about the immigrant detainees and the sort of infamous uterus collector doctor at this prison, there are some other ethical considerations that come up. Now, in general, everyone agreed that the actions of that doctor, if these allegations are in fact proven true in court, that those should be the basis for him losing his license, and for the majority of you also probably grounds for him being arrested and sent to prison. Now, many of you also argued that ICDC, the prison there, should be shut down if these kind of violations are going on and continue to be going on. Although some people raise concerns about, if that were to happen, where would all the detainees go? How would that be managed? We know from kind of just the history of how Department of Homeland Security and ICE operate that there are kind of a whole range of public and private detention facilities that are always sort of in operation and people are being moved back and forth between. So my suspicion is that there would be space in another facility that, should these detainees need to be sent, that could be done. So I think that's less of a worry, but certainly something that we would want to think about how that might impact our broader story. Now, some of you also raised concerns about the fact that prisons in particular are a major source where COVID has been spreading just because of the sort of tight-knit interactions and that kind of congregate environment, as the health professionals call it. So this raises a different kind of ethical question, which is, because the way American society tends to view criminals and criminality, do we somehow give less ethical importance to detainees and people in prison compared to the broader sort of public? And is there a sense in which our ethics put them lower down on the kind of moral value chain where we say, well, we need to take care of elderly and frontline healthcare workers and people with pre-existing conditions and B and C and D, and somewhere by the time we get down to W, X, or Y, then maybe we can think about prisoners and people that are detained in some way. And is that itself sort of a reflection of a broader sort of ethical view or framework when it comes to thinking about criminality and how and who we prioritize in terms of health risks from COVID? Now, another question that people wrestled with was a long-standing one, which is, how should the United States treat immigrants in our country that are undocumented, and should there be different rights and laws and safeguards in place depending on whether you're a citizen or not? There was certainly some disagreement about that, but I think everyone generally agreed that regardless of someone's immigration status, they should basically deserve basic humane treatment regardless of the circumstances. Now, it's important to note in this case, and we don't know all the details yet since a lot of the complainants in this class action lawsuit we were reading about are still unnamed, but we know in general that there's a good chance that at least some of these immigrants at the ICDC were not necessarily there because of immigration law violations, but were actually waiting on asylum petitions. So these would have been women, at least in this case, who had fled to the United States seeking political asylum because of some situation back home that they were trying to get away from, that they felt their life was in jeopardy. could have been gang violence, sex trafficking, a whole range of different possible scenarios that we know from studies done on refugees and political violence. So an important ethical question to think about would be, do these kind of background considerations and circumstances matter in a case like this, and how much should we take them into account, and in what ways should we think about them? It may not reflect specifically on the actions, for example, of the doctor or prison staff, but may speak to kind of broader issues of our ethical approach to sort of the other, as the literature sometimes refers to this sort of insider-outsider approach around immigration. Now, many of you also argued that the Office of Inspector General should do something, and some kind of political pressure or public pressure should be put on them if they, for whatever reason, decided not to open an investigation into these cases. And we know, in fact, that members of Congress have written to the Department of Homeland Security asking them to investigate. But here we get into kind of a tricky area of politics, which is essentially what you're asking is the Department of Homeland Security to do an internal investigation of their own immigration detention practices and the various subcontractors like ICDC that they use to hold detainees. And so we can imagine there are some pretty obvious reasons why the Department of Homeland Security would not want to highlight these violations and would prefer essentially that any ethical violations or other possibly illegal practices were not exposed because public perceptions. Right? So there's kind of a self-interested, self-preservation aspect there where Office of Inspector General, the OIG, might have pressure put on them to kind of turn a blind eye or find that maybe some things had gone wrong in the past, but now they've been resolved. So there's some questions about the accountability of that process. And this is where we get to this sort of weird fox guarding the hen house kind of problem. And we'll see this kind of same underlying ethical issue come up again in future weeks when we look at Black Lives Matter protests and some of the issues around police brutality, where we have to ask ourselves, what happens when the people in charge of enforcing and overseeing the law are actually themselves the ones that are breaking the law or causing violations? And, in kind of pop culture terminology, we might say, who watches the watchers? Right? So this is another important political question that has deeper ethical implications. We want to assume that the law is there to treat everyone equally and provide all the various safeguards that are in place that come with sort of a fixed and secure legal system. But what happens when those officers of the law themselves feel entitled or warranted to either push, break, or ignore at times these laws? Then what kind of ethical responses should we have as citizens, or more broadly kind of as individuals? How do we think about the ethical challenges and responses to situations like this? Okay, those are just a couple of things I wanted to raise based on your discussion questions and the commentary back and forth from people's comments to help us think a little bit more about some of the underlying ethical dilemmas here. Okay, thanks everybody. I'll talk to you all again soon.